import content that we created inside of Adobe Photoshop in order to create a standard web banner. We'll also go ahead and animate those different assets across the web banner. And finally, at the end, include a call to action, which is actually interactive and will take the user to the web page of your choice as the banner author. Animate is used to create ads like this all the time, and it's a great way to repurpose some of the content that we've done in other projects for this purpose. So hey, let's create a banner. Okay, so before we actually start building our project, we need to go over something really important. We need to understand what copyright is and how to understand different copyright licenses that you might find when you're perhaps looking for content to use in your projects. So we're going to have a brief look at that right now. First off, some standard copyright rules. So note that copyright, if it exists, continues until 70 years after the death of the author. So in order to use something that somebody created, you would need to actually have to wait until 70 years after their death. So if somebody's creating content right now that you admire, you're not going to be able to use it straight up if they claim copyright on it, and you probably won't be able to do so in your lifetime. Most songs, videos, and images all have copyright applied to them, whether explicit or implicit. It's important to note that the ideas themselves do not have copyright applied. So just having an idea is not enough to claim copyright. The web gets a little tricky. The safest thing to do is that when you're citing a web-based resource, to always use both the URL that you get from the address bar and the date that you looked at it and acquired that information. Of course, copyright infringement is going to make you look bad and could get you in a lot of trouble. You could receive fines or even jail time. Always obtain permission before use and try to be as fair and open as possible when using materials that are not your own. A standard way of applying copyright to different items that creators can show how they would like the copyright to actually be applied by others is through the Creative Commons system. You'll see this all over the place. There are three main types of licenses that are kind of split into two groups. We have basic attribution, where you'll see CC BY. And what this entails is that you're letting others distribute, remix, tweak, and build upon your work, even commercially, as long as they credit you for the original creation. So this is all about credit. The second one you see here, share alike, CC BY-SA. This license lets others remix, tweak, and build upon your work, even for commercial purposes, as long as they credit you and license their new creations under the identical terms. So it's very similar to attribution. However, you have to use the same exact license that the original creation actually used. Then you've got no derivs, CC BY-ND. This license, it lets others reuse your work for anything they like, including commercial stuff. However, it cannot be shared with others in its adapted form, and credit must be provided to you. Now, these three at the bottom, you'll notice that they're very similar to the three we just went over. However, they also include the terms NC and non-commercial. So these are basically just variants of the three that we already saw, except they do not allow any commercial use. All right, so let's get started building up our web banner. We're going to get this screen here, which is going to give us all these different categories. And look at that, we have an ads category. So that's just perfect. And I want to make a banner ad. Here is the banner ad preset, 468 by 60. So we're going to choose 468 by 60 here for the width. If we wanted to pull the frame rate down here, we could. Like maybe I'll take this down to 24 just because we don't really need it to be up at 30. And here, this is super important. The platform type is going to be HTML5 canvas. So we can always switch that here, but we really wouldn't want to. When it comes to banner ads and the web, probably the safest option that you're going to find is HTML5 canvas. It is web native. It doesn't require any sort of plugins or extensions or anything like that. It'll just run in any modern web browser. So let's go ahead and create this document. All right, so we can see here, we've got a single layer, of course, with a single frame. And then over in our publish settings, if we have a look at this, and we can even see up here, it's publishing to HTML5 canvas. Let's go to more settings. There's our JavaScript/HTML, so we know it's actually going to publish appropriately for the native web. And down here, 468 by 60 is the standard web banner size. I'm going to just take my stage color to black, and the FPS is 24, so we're pretty good right here. Maybe I'm going to go in and just go to 200% to make that a little bigger, and that's great. So from here on, what do we need to do? Well, one thing I need to do is save this document. So let's choose File, Save. I'm going to just name this banner.fla. And note again that every single type of document that you produce inside of Animate can be used as an FLA file. So it's a platform agnostic document type. If we're doing stuff for Flash Player or for Air or for WebGL or for HTML5 Canvas, for iOS, for Android, it really does not matter. It's going to be an FLA document. So hit save. And there we go. We're now saved. So I'm actually going to pop over to Photoshop right now. And inside of Photoshop, I have banner.psd opened up. This is a design that I've already spec'd out here for our web banner. So you'll notice that we have our little Electric Revenant Productions logo here that we created a while ago, and the appropriate text for that, and a bit of electricity for the background, just the static looking stuff that we just generated inside of Photoshop. So here you can see that we've got different layers. So Electric Revenant, Production, Revenant, and BG. So you could change the names of these if you want to, and they would come in a little bit cleaner, but these are probably just fine as they are. Notice too, we have a couple of effects here, like the pattern overlay and color overlays, just to get that sort of effect working, right? All right, so if you save your PSD file and then pop back over to Adobe Animate, we now need to import this PSD file. So just like how we imported the Adobe Illustrator file for a previous logo project, we're going to choose File, Import, and we're going to import to Stage. This is going to place all of the assets on our stage. Now we have to choose banner.psd. Perfect. Hit Open. And now that it's brought in the banner, it's going to show us all the different layers that we had in our Photoshop document. And you can see that they're named exactly the same way that the layers were named inside Photoshop. So we've got two text layers, our logo layer, and the background layer. And right now, the way it's bringing it in is it's flattening everything to a bitmap image. So all of those effects that I had on my bg.ping layer are going to be applied and flattened down to a nice little ping file. So that's perfect. Note that we can also choose to wrap each of these in a movie clip symbol. We're not going to do that quite yet, but it's an option that's nice to have in case you wanted to do that. We'll actually take care of that step by step as we go through the project. In terms of publish settings, this is really useful. You can use the publish setting that this kind of came in at, or you can change it to something custom and calculate the bitmap size. So in terms of web banners, you do want to keep this really, really small. However, this is something you can change later on through the library by looking at the properties of each bitmap image as well. Down here, we can choose whether to bring it in as animate layers, a single animate layer, or across keyframes. We want to keep this as animate layers. We just want to transfer the layers from Photoshop into animate. We do want to place the objects at their original position. And we could choose to set stage size the same. However, it already is the same, so it'd be pointless to choose that option. And all we have to do is hit import to bring that stuff in. That was super quick. And you can see here that we've now got a number of different layers. So if I pull this across, we've got our layer 1, which was the original layer, which is empty. I'm going to just hit delete to delete that layer. We've got bg_ping. And you know what? I'm going to double click on each of these and just kind of clean up the names. So revenant_ping, that's our logo. So maybe I'll rename that to Revenant logo. We've got productions. And then electric_revenant. So just cleaning up that text so it makes more sense. Maybe I'll get rid of this little underscore here as well. And then when I'm ready, I can lock these down and save my file once again. The only thing we really need to do before we move on is to check out different ruler settings, guide settings, and things like that, snap settings. And notice in the properties panel for document, we actually have shortcuts to all this stuff. So we can snap to objects, snap align, show rulers or not, and also lock our guides. We don't have any guides right now. But if you want to look at even more stuff in there, you can always go to the view menu and you can toggle the rulers from there. You've got your different grid settings. So if you go to edit grid, here we can show our grid, choose the color, choose to have it show over objects or under. You can snap to grid and so forth, and even specify the size of our grid. So right now it's 10 by 10 squares. Additionally, we have our guides. Again, we don't have guides right now, but if we did, there are different things we can use to deal with our guides, like changing the color and so forth. And the last thing, of course, is going to be our snap settings. Right now, snap to grid and snap to pixels is off. I want to edit my snapping options because I want to turn all this stuff on. I like to snap generally, unless I'm doing sort of free-form drawing. So snapping is going to keep things snap to pixels. And this one, snap bitmaps to pixels, is especially useful when dealing with HTML5 canvas. So hit OK there. And with those options, we are set to continue with our project. All right, let's get animating this stuff here. What we need to do first, of course, is to extend our frames so that we're able to produce some sort of animation, since we currently only have a single frame. So let's go to frame 60 or so, and we'll just click and drag across all those frames, all those layers, and then we're going to choose to insert frames. That's going to extend the frame span out from 1 to 60, and now we can shift the playhead back and forth. An important thing to note here is if we go ahead and unlock everything but the background layer, because we're not going to animate that, and we select any of these objects on the stage, you'll notice inside of the properties panel for object properties that these are all bitmaps, because that's how we brought them in. Now, this poses a problem because bitmaps by themselves cannot be animated. We can't put like a shape tween or a motion tween or a classic tween on a bitmap. We have to first convert these things or wrap them up in some sort of a symbol, whether that's a movie clip symbol or a graphic symbol or a button symbol. So what we're going to do in this case is use graphic symbols just for simplicity, because we don't need any sort of movie clip symbol properties to deal with here. We're just going to make them graphic symbols because we want to just animate them simply. So I'm going to select my little logo here. And what we can do is right click. And if we go down here, you can see that there is a convert to symbol option that we can use, or we can go up to the modify menu and choose convert to symbol. This brings up our convert to symbol dialog. And sure enough, graphic is selected. That's great. We want this to be a graphic symbol. And I'm going to give it the name of logo. So pretty simple. Hit OK. And I also want to do the same thing to the text. Now the text gives me some options here because it's broken into 2 lines. So I'm going to actually create 2 separate objects to animate separately here. So again, choosing electric revenant, modify, convert to symbol, and I'm just going to say ER_TXT for electric revenant text, and OK. And do the same thing to productions. So modify, convert to symbol, P_TXT, graphic symbol, perfect. All right, so if I select any of these bits and pieces now, we can see that they are instances of different graphic symbols, and we do have some additional stuff here, like looping. However, these things don't actually have any internal timeline animation. If I double click on here, we can see that they're a single frame, so that really doesn't matter that much. Let's go back out to scene 1. And at this point, we can think about how we actually want to animate these things. Now that we have our graphic symbols, we can go ahead and actually do some animation. So let's scroll back over so we can see all the frames here. And all you need to do is click and drag a selection across all these layers. Just select a bunch of frames in each layer, and it's super easy to do. You don't need to be precise about this at all. You can select as many as you want here. And from there, we're going to create classic tweens on each of these layers. So to do that, we can go and hit Create Classic Tween, which is this button right here. Boom, Classic Tweens. You could also choose to create classic tweens, of course, by right-clicking and choosing Create Classic Tween. Now, you can see that these tweens are actually broken right now. When you see this dashed or dotted line, it means that it's an incomplete or broken tween. So what we need to do is to add in keyframes, because classic tweens work very similarly to shape tweens, in that you need at least 2 keyframes to tween between, right? That's what tween means, is between. So at frame 60, let's go ahead and just drag a selection across all these different layers at frame 60. And from here, we can then use our frame dropdown and insert keyframes. And there we go. We see now we have a complete tween. Of course, you could also use the insert menu, timeline, and add in frames and keyframes that way. There's a couple of options inside of Animate that you can always use. What we're going to do now is move over to frame 1, because right now, everything at frame 60 and everything at frame 1 is exactly the same. There's no motion going on, no animation whatsoever. So let's create some. From here, I'm going to drag a selection rectangle across all of our different elements. So all 3 are selected. Then holding down the Shift key, I'm just going to pull them onto my pasteboard on the other side of the stage here. Now, if I go ahead and hit play, we can see they kind of come in all at once, and we do have some basic animation going on at this point. However, I want these things to sort of come in a staggered way. So I'm going to change the positioning of these different keyframes, both the first keyframe and the second, so things appear and, come in at different rates, at different times, and so forth. It'll make it a lot more interesting. So let's take our logo, first of all, so Revenant logo. And if I select that keyframe and then mouse over it, I can then click and drag, and notice that little icon near my cursor. It shows that I can drag this keyframe I'm going to drag this out to around frame 10. I want the logo to come in right about there. And let's have it sort of stop around frame 30. So there the logo comes in first, and it comes in much faster now too. In terms of our text, I want the first bit of text to come in at frame 30. So Electric Revenant, let's bring you in. You can pop in at 30. And I want this to be pretty quick too, so let's actually bring this down to 50. And then for productions, I want that text to come in around 40. So I want it to follow the initial text. And I can leave that at 60. That's just fine. Now, note here, we've got some broken tweens, of course, because there aren't additional keyframes. But we don't really need these tweens here. They're just kind of like leftover tweens. So to remove those, all you have to do is right-click and choose Remove Classic Tween. This one too, Broken Tween, Remove Classic Tween. There we go. Now that's going to look a lot better. Let's go ahead and rewind and play it back and see how it looks. All right, that's pretty good. So one more thing to go over, and that is onion skinning. So if you look up here, you'll find your onion skin options. So I'm going to toggle that on, and we can see kind of how that looks. Now, with onion skinning, if I move my cursor around, or my playhead rather, with my cursor, you can see that we've got 1, 2, 1, 2. We've got 2 frames that show up as having been already passed by the playhead. So they're frames that have already triggered, and there they are in blue right there. And then we have 2 frames that are coming up past the playhead, and those are highlighted in green. Now what we can do is actually shift these markers. So if we wanted to change each of these to 4 to see sort of more detail on where things are coming in, we can do that and see it pretty nicely there. The current frame is showing up just as it looks, proper here. Now, if we hold down the mouse, note that we can use a selected range, which is what we're doing right now, indicated by these markers. We can also choose all frames. We can anchor the markers, and if we anchor markers, now if we move the playhead back and forth, the markers themselves don't move with the playhead. However, if I turn that back off, now when I shift the playhead again, everything moves with it. So this kind of depends on what you're doing, what particular options you want to use. Now, inside of Animate and beyond, we also have advanced settings. So this is kind of a brand new feature that you can look at. And this allows you to access a lot of the same things. So range or all frames. You can also set the previous and next frames, which we changed by markers over here. But you can change the coloring too. So if you wanted these previous and next frames to show up in different colors, you could change that. And you can also change both the starting opacity and how much it decreases by with each frame. So depending upon how you're working, these are different options for you to use. You can also toggle on keyframes only. So in that case, I only have a single keyframe here, unless I kind of go over here. And now this keyframe falls within our marker range. So many different options. One more is the onion skin outlines. And in that case, you see everything in outline form. So again, depending upon what kind of stuff you're dealing with is going to depend upon your choices here, but it's definitely something to play with and explore. If you goof things up, you can always hit Reset Onion Skin Settings, and they'll go back to the defaults. And you can close that out whenever you want. And of course, to disable onion skinning, you just toggle that button again. Now that we've animated all this stuff here, notice that there's a big area on this side of the stage that is actually pretty empty. We've left this empty on purpose because this is going to be our call to action. This is going to include a button that's going to pop up that the user can click to visit the website or whatever. So what we need to do is create a new layer to contain this button. So I'm going to lock all my other layers. So everything's locked right now. And I'm going to insert a new layer and name it button. There we go. All right, with my button layer created, I'm going to go ahead and insert a keyframe at frame 60. So the final frame right here. And I can insert a keyframe or a blank keyframe in this case. It really doesn't matter because it's going to just duplicate the previous keyframe, and the previous keyframe is a blank keyframe. There's nothing inside of it. And that's all a blank keyframe is. It's a keyframe that doesn't have any content on the stage. So now we need to create a button inside of that keyframe. So for that, you can choose something like your rectangle tool, or you can even choose the rectangle primitive tool, which is kind of like hidden inside of it. You just long press and choose rectangle primitive. And then let's examine our different tool settings here. So we can see this tool that we have selected is the rectangle primitive tool, and we can choose both fill and stroke. So for my fill color, I'm going to choose this nice kind of light blue. I want it to stand out a little bit from the purple background, so light blue is going to be pretty good. For my stroke, I want there to be a stroke, and I want it to be a darker blue. So let's see. That's a little too blue. There we go. That's a little more neutral. All right, so there's my fill and my stroke. And for stroke size, I'm going to put that up to 4. I think that's going to be a nice thick stroke for us. Style width, I want that to all be the same. However, for scaling, let's change that to none. I'm going to turn on hinting. And as it says here, hinting keeps stroke anchors on full pixels to prevent blurry lines. So this is super useful when you're doing something like we're doing here, where we're going to be using our different corner radiuses to make a rounded button. So this will keep things clean for us. All right, so down in our rectangle options, here we can choose between the rectangle corner radius, and we can even have a different radius on each corner, but I want them to be all the same. And for this, I'm going to choose to have a border radius of 6. All right, so our rectangle primitive tool is configured. We just need to draw out the rectangle now. That's going to be the background skin for our button. We want it to be something like 100 by 34 or so. So I'm going to drag that out right there and switch to the selection tool and choose the object. So right now the width is 110. Let's kind of tweak that a little bit. I want it to be straight up 100. And for height, let's go to 36. That's probably pretty good. That's a nice fat button there. And let's see. We're going to want to actually adjust this so it's sort of centered. And I'm thinking maybe 34 or 35 might be a little bit better here. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And we can even use, of course, the align panel in order to get this just right. So if I put that there and I stick that there, and just hold down Shift and move over 10 pixels. And of course, now it looks like 36 is going to work. So let's go to 36 once again. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so we've got our button skin down here. It's looking really nice. So the next thing we need to do is actually convert this, because right now it's still a rectangle primitive object. We want to change this into a button. And note also that because we use the rectangle primitive tool, that we still have all those different options that we had originally. If we used a simple rectangle tool, we wouldn't be able to change things like the corner radius after we created the object. We'd be stuck with it. So this gives us a little more options if we want to tweak stuff. All right, so with this little rectangle primitive selected, I'm going to choose Modify, Convert to Symbol, because we want to change this into a button symbol. I'm going to give it the name of Visit and underscore BTN. You don't have to put these little labels in here declaring what the objects are, but sometimes it's helpful to be able to glance and see whether something's text or button or whatever. So here we have our type, and we want to choose button in this case, because buttons are pretty special inside of Animate, and we'll see why in a moment. So when we've got all that in, hit OK. And now you can see it looks a little different on the stage. And it is an instance of visit_btn, a button symbol. With our button created, we now need to establish the intricacies of the insides of the button and create our button states. So let's double click on that and do some edits. So double click brings us into the visit_btn timeline. And note here, the timeline is very different from timelines that we've seen previously. We've got dedicated up, over, down, and hit states in the timeline. Button symbols only have these 4 specific frames. So let's go ahead and duplicate our keyframes across all these different states by just hitting insert keyframe for each one. And then we're going to rename layer_1 to skin because this contains our button skin, so our button background. Our up state is actually what we created already, but we can modify how the over and down states look. So let's go to our over state. Our up state is kind of like our resting state. That's when like nothing's happening. There's no interactivity. This is what the button's going to look like. But on our over state, we want to make this change a little bit to indicate that a hover or an over is occurring. So if you mouse over a button, this is what's going to trigger our over state. So it's going to be an indicator to the user that they can actually click the button. Let's lighten everything up a bit. I'm going to use my color picker here to just lighten up both the fill and the stroke. And then if we kind of jump from one to another, we can see that that definitely looks different, right? It's going to indicate to the user they can click on that. For our down state, that's when the user actually presses on it. So they'll get some kind of like response to their click. They know that something's been clicked. And what I'm going to do here is just kind of make this darker. So I'm going to darken it up quite a bit. There's our dark fill. And we're going to darken the stroke up as well. There we go. So now we have our 3 visual states to our skin. And in terms of the hit state itself is an invisible state. It only really shows or indicates to animate the area of pixels which should be interactive. So in this case, we want the area that somebody can click to be the exact same size and shape as our visual elements. However, you could actually make this any shape and any size you want, though that could be detrimental to the user's accessibility and usability concerns. All right, in this case, we can leave it exactly like it is. I'm going to lock that layer down. And what we'll do before we move on is kind of have a look at how this is going to work. So I'm going to go back out to scene 1, and then I'm going to go ahead and test movie. So here's our banner going right now, but as you can see, it loops like crazy and we can't actually click on the button. And also, when we actually tested this in our output, we've got some warnings here. Don't be afraid of these warnings. They're just letting you know what Animate's doing to like pack up your bitmap textures and things like that, and specific things around some of the libraries that you deal with inside of HTML5 Canvas. Generally, you can ignore these and just click on Timeline to continue your work. So in order to test this more effectively, let's go into our document properties and our publish settings to more settings. And note right here, this first option allows you to choose whether or not to loop the timeline. So let's turn loop timeline off and hit OK. Now if I test again, it'll repackage everything. We'll see the animation, and there we go. It stops the timeline. It doesn't loop it anymore. And we can now see that our button is working with all of its different states. So here's the up state, over state, and down state when I press. Of course, if I press, nothing's actually happening because we don't have any interactive elements on there yet. All right, so our button is fully functional with all its different states. However, it's really ambiguous right now. It doesn't really tell the user anything. We need some sort of text here as a button label to be able to catch the user's eye and give them a little more information about what's going to happen when they click that button. So let's double click to go back into the button timeline. And we have our skin layer here with all the different states defined. Let's add a new layer, and you can name this label or text or whatever you like. I'm just going to name it label. And we're just going to add some text that's going to go across each and every one of these particular states here. For our hit state, we don't need anything, so I'm going to insert a blank keyframe right there because all we need is this visual data to show up on our visual states. So to actually create text, we're going to use the text tool. So find the text tool inside the tools panel. And here are our different options for this tool. We can choose static text, or we can choose dynamic text. Input text is also a choice. However, it's not available inside of HTML5 Canvas. So the difference between static and dynamic is that static text cannot be changed at runtime. When you publish with static text, everything is converted into shapes. Dynamic text can actually have its text values changed at runtime programmatically through code. And this can be used to, just change the labels of different things or display something like a score or greeting or something that's customized to the user. So with static text, you're basically using any of the different fonts that are available on your computer. However, with dynamic text, it's best to use a web font for that, with HTML5 Canvas at least. Different platforms are going to differ quite a bit. So let's have a look at dynamic text first, although that's not what we're going to stick with for our banner. In order to add web fonts, right next to the name of the font in the character properties for the tool, you can click this little globe looking thing here and choose to add web fonts. You can choose fonts from both Adobe fonts and Google fonts. I'm going to just go to Adobe fonts. It's really your choice what you want to do. Basically, it'll bring up this little window here and either load in a chooser for that particular font library. So because I've chosen Adobe fonts, it's gone ahead and loaded up Adobe fonts for me. Adobe fonts used to be called Typekit. So Typekit and Adobe fonts are the same thing, if you're curious. And Google fonts, it would just load up a Google Fonts picker here. So the process is basically the same. What you would do is search, and you can go and sort by different types of fonts. You can filter your fonts by different classifications and properties, or you can just scroll down and find one that suits you. So I want something that's pretty readable. And let's see here. Maybe I actually will use the filters here. So I want a sans serif font, and I want it suitable for headings. I want it to be really thick. So let's see what we get here. This one actually looks pretty good. Paralucent. Let's go ahead and use that. I'm going to click on Paralucent, and it's going to give me a bunch of different, it's going to show me how the font's going to look with all these different variations. So I'm just going to select that and hit OK. And what's going to happen is Animate's going to go out to Adobe Fonts, and it's going to license that font. You can see here in the output panel, one web font family is added. So perfect. Go back to my timeline. And now if I use my drop down here, any web fonts are going to show up at the very, very top. So check that out. We've got the Creative Cloud symbol here with Paralucent. So I'm going to choose that. I can choose the type. I want this to be probably demi-bold, something like that. And for fill, let's actually make that, well, maybe just a little off-white. Actually, maybe kind of orangey, since we've got, well, we're kind of yellow. That's fine. Let's use yellow. So here we can go ahead and either click or click and drag to create either point or paragraph text. I'm just going to click, and I just want to say visit. That's what I want my type to say. So there it is. And we can go ahead and sort of shift these down if we want to, make them a little smaller, and so forth. So if I pull this down, that's going to look pretty good. And note that even though the actual bounding box of my typeface is actually extending past the button, because we don't have it on the hit state, it's not going to impact our clickable area. Clickable area is still going to be what's defined in the hit state, which is just the button skin. And you could change the color of the button across each of these if you wanted to. However, I don't really care to do that. I want to just keep it the same. As mentioned, there's really no need to make this dynamic text other than to demonstrate how to use Adobe fonts and Google fonts and things like that. So we could always convert this back to static text and apply that text in there. But what you could also do is just with this font selected, just right click and just choose convert to bitmap. Convert to bitmap can be used to convert any of your vector assets to simple bitmap images. So note that now that I've selected convert to bitmap, this is now a bitmap image. And if I look inside my library, it exists right here as a new bitmap image. And I can, of course, rename this if I want to. And it's right aside from all our different symbols and even a folder full of the images that we originally imported from Photoshop. So now we're pretty much completely done in here. And you might notice that things look a little jaggy. And the reason for that, if we go back out to scene 1, remember that we're at 200% here. So we're doubling the size of all of our pixels. If I go down to 100%, you can see that things look a lot nicer. The thing is, with these standard sizes for web banners and even mobile banners, they're pretty small. It's, a whole 60 pixels that we have to deal with here. So our resulting banners for this stuff is going to be small, but that's just the way that the ad industry works right now in terms of generating web ads, web banners, and things of that nature. These are standards we've used for the past decade or more, and there's no sign that they're going to change anytime soon. With our button completed, we now need to make it actually interactive, where when somebody clicks on it, they actually go and open up another web page and are able to see whatever the ad is for, right? So to do that, what we're going to do first of all is create a new layer right above our button layer. And we're going to rename this to the name of actions and lock it down. Now, the actions layer is just sort of like a convention that's used inside of animate in order to keep our code completely separate from any visual elements. So it's common practice to create a new layer called actions and just have all your code inside that actions layer with no visual elements on that layer. We want the actual code to live at frame 60 right here because that's when our button exists. So we're going to add a new keyframe there to match the keyframe with our button. And one thing we do need to do to our button is we need to give it some sort of identifier so that we can sort of talk to the button instance through code. So let's click on the visit button here, and we can see this is a button. And notice right underneath there that we can provide an instance name. The instance name is exactly what we need to be able to reference this through JavaScript in this case, because we're using HTML5 Canvas. But if you were using ActionScript or some other language, an instance name is going to give you access to that particular object. So we're just going to name this visit. And note that we're just using all lowercase. Uppercase, lowercase, it just has to match where you use it. So if we did uppercase V here, when we code it up, we just have to use uppercase V. If we keep it at lowercase like this, then it's less to worry about. So now we have an instance name of visit on there. Perfect. We can actually lock the button layer. So we have all of our layers locked down at this point. And note that this is exactly how you would give an instance name to a movie clip symbol instance as well. You just give it an instance name. Graphic symbols are different in that their instances cannot receive instance names. They cannot be interactive. They're only for animation purposes. All right, so what we need to do is add some code to frame 60 on our actions layer. So click on frame 60. And then if you notice inside the properties panel for the frame properties, we've got this little icon right here. It's a circle with an arrow in it. If we click on that, it's going to open up the actions panel for us. There's our actions panel. You can also get to the actions panel through window actions. So what we're going to do is actually write some code in here in order to make our visit button clickable. However, most people, when they're first approaching this, they don't know what to write in terms of code. Even though it's JavaScript code, we are using some different libraries and things like that under the hood. Things could differ from what's normally done. What's really cool about the Actions panel in more recent versions of Adobe Animate is that we have this option to add using wizard. So instead of just typing code right here in the script pane, we can choose add using wizard, and we can build our code interactively step by step. So what we're going to do here is in step 1, select an action. So what do we want to have happen? And there's a bunch of different actions here, and these actions are all particular to our current platform, which is HTML5 Canvas. We want the user, once they click on the button, to go to web page. So let's choose that. And note that Animate inserts some code here. We can change the URL right here if we want to. Electric Revenant Productions doesn't actually exist, so there isn't an actual URL for them. So we'll just keep it at adobe.com and hit next. So step 2, we have to select a triggering event. The triggering event in this case is going to be a simple mouse click. So we find on mouse click and select that. And then we have to select an object for the triggering event. Now, recall that we named our button instance visit right before we came in here. So Animate is smart enough that it knows the different instance names that we've given specific instances on the stage, and it can show them to us here for selection. So we don't even have to remember quite what we named this or what the spelling was. We can just click on the one that we know exists right here, visit. It happens to be the only one we've given an instance name because we only have one button. And when we're finished, we're going to go ahead and finish and add. And then we're brought back into the script pane. And we can see that in scene 1 on our actions layer on frame 60, that we have this code right here. So you can read these different comments that it inserts if you want to understand a little more about what's going on. But basically, once you click on the object with the name visit, click on that, and it's going to open up a new window and go to adobe.com. So pretty simple stuff. At this point, we can actually exit out of our actions panel. And if you look down here, we've got a little A that shows up in our actions layer at frame 60. And that indicates that we have code attached to that particular frame in that particular layer. All right, so let's go ahead and try this out. We're going to go ahead and test movie. All right, our animation comes in. There's our visit button. We're able to hover over there, press down, and when we click, look at that. It goes straight to adobe.com, and perfect. We're actually finished with the interactive bits for our web banner. All right, so up until now, what we've been doing is just using test movie to sort of preview everything in the browser. When you actually want to publish, though, there are additional options that you can look at. So inside of our document properties here, under publish settings, if we go to more settings, we can have a look at some of these different options. So by default, it's going to publish as JavaScript/HTML. When you choose HTML5 canvas for something like a web ad like this, that is going to be your target platform. So here we have a number of additional tabs on the side. You can change the output name and location, so change folders and so forth. We already saw that you can loop the timeline or not. So we don't want the timeline to loop here. And incidentally, you can also stop the timeline using code through the Actions wizard if you want to. We can include hidden layers. We don't happen to have any hidden layers in our banner, so this really doesn't matter in our case. The next part is pretty neat though. You're able to say whether you want to center the stage, and the choices here are horizontal, vertical, or both. You can also make it responsive. So in this case, if the viewport of the browser is too small to contain our banner, it's actually going to scale it down to fit in view. You can also scale up. It depends on what you're actually doing, whether this is a good idea or not, but you can scale up to fill the visible area, fit in view, or stretch to fit. So things can be distorted if you choose something like stretch to fit. It'll actually stretch it out. You can also include a preloader. So if this was a very heavy animation, we could choose a specific preloader to use. And it's basically a tiny animated GIF that's going to play before it loads everything up. So some additional options here. You can export your image assets to a specific image path. You can export them as a texture, a sprite sheet, or as individual image assets. If you choose texture or sprite sheet, what it's going to do is combine all those images together into one big image file, and it'll also create a data file to go along with that in order to match different regions as needed. Note here that it'll also convert shapes to bitmaps for better performance. And you've got some advanced settings here as well. So when you click on advanced image settings, you go to the image settings tab right here. And here you can choose the quality, whether it's 8-bit or 32-bit, the resolution, the maximum size of your texture, and which particular symbols you want to include in your texture. It's really pretty expansive, the amount of options you have for images now when using HTML5 Canvas. Going back to basic, we can also specify a folder for sound assets and create.js assets. Now, create.js is the set of libraries and files in JavaScript that is used when you use HTML5 Canvas and Animate. So you definitely need create.js assets. However, you can either use them from a content delivery network or just built in like this. Either way is fine. If we go to HTML/JS, you can create custom templates if you want. And how you use this is you just sort of export an HTML template, and then you can modify different parts of it. And it's marked up with comments and things like that. So if you were doing things more advanced, you could change some of the things there and then import and apply it. And it would use that template on publish settings. You can overwrite your HTML file on publish or choose not to. If you want to kind of compact what gets spit out by animate when you publish, you can actually include your JavaScript within your HTML, and then you're not going to have a separate JavaScript file. It'll all be contained in one HTML file. Now, I mentioned content delivery networks. This is the option for that. So if you untick this, then back in the basic tab, it'll actually export your create.js libraries right here. However, if you choose to use hosted libraries, it's going to use libraries that are hosted on external servers. You can choose to compact shapes, choose multi-frame bounds if you wish, and this is only useful if you're doing some extensive checking against different bounds of objects like collision detection and things like that for games inside of HTML5 Canvas. Otherwise, keep it unchecked because it does generate a lot of data. And then you've got your different namespaces. Don't change these unless you really know what you're doing, unless you really need to. Image settings we already saw. So here are our advanced image settings. You get there from advanced image settings right here. And these are the same options that we already saw. You can choose from texture, sprite sheets, or basic image assets. When you're finished with these settings, you just hit publish, and you can see it publishes out all your stuff ready to be served on the server of your choosing. An additional thing that I'll mention here is, of course, you can publish, but you've also got a ton of different options for exporting. So if we go to File, Export, note that we can export this as a single ping image, JPEG, SVG, whatever. We can also export movie, which is going to allow us to export a sequence of images. We can export video and media, which we've seen in a previous video, but we can also export animated GIF. So let's check out export animated GIF. All right, so here is our export image dialog, and it's fairly large, as you can see here. But these are the settings that you use to export an animated GIF. So we can change whether it loops forever or just once. We can preview the animation here. And depending upon all the different settings we use, we can change sort of how this looks and behaves. So if you don't want to export this as HTML5 canvas with all that JavaScript and everything behind it, you can always export as a tiny little animated GIF and then use that as well. It all depends on the type of ad network that you're targeting and your own particular needs for the project.